Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte. This is the podcast which asks the tricky questions about the world around us. I'm George, and today we're asking, how is the conversation about disability at work changing? Hello and thank you for downloading this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We're right in the middle of season 5 right now, and you can find all of our previous episodes on our website, which is deloitte.co.uk/Green Room Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast from. Please do hit subscribe and it'll magically appear in your feed. And today I'm joined by all-round good guy, Ethan Worth. How are you, Ethan?
Feeling like an all-round good guy. Thanks, George. But yeah, no, it's you're starting to feel the bite of winter a bit at the moment and possibly have a slight cold. But what better way to inspire you than talking to two passionate and driven guests that we've got today. So really excited for the pod.
Yeah, I totally echo your thoughts there, Ethan. Winter is coming hard, thick and fast, but we've got a nice podcast here to really get our teeth into. And today we're talking about disability at work, and it's something which I've been really wanting to talk about for ages. Actually, it's such a huge topic. There's so much to cover, and actually, I think the last couple of years of changing our working habits has really allowed us to have a really good impetus, and hopefully makes the basis for a great conversation. Actually, I was fascinated to see that as part of the research for this. There are 14 million disabled people in the UK. So 1 in 5 people in the UK are disabled. So it's something that affects a huge part of the population. And it's a complex subject as well. So hopefully we've got some excellent guests who can chat us through it. And who do we have in the studio today, Ethan?
Well, we're in luck, George. We do have two very distinguished guests, as usual. We're joined by Mark Hodgkinson, who is the CEO of Scope, the disability equality charity in England and Wales. Mark has led businesses through major changes in many different sectors. He is also a non-executive director of social enterprise UMF. Welcome, Mark.
Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. We're also joined by Zeinab. Zeinab Chaudhary is a senior manager in Deloitte's human capital change practice and is passionate about creating a more balanced society through inclusion. She is also the Disability Inclusion Lead across Deloitte Consulting and Workability Network Deputy Lead. Welcome, Zeinab.
Hello, lovely to be here.
Thanks, and congratulations on your Management Consultancy Award. I saw all the emails coming through.
Thank you so much.
So at this point, we are usually greeted with a pop-up of a icebreaker question. Okay, so this one's come up. What year would you visit if you had a time machine?
I can go on this one. The year that pops into mind is 1996. And this is a year where my siblings went to Disneyland Paris and I couldn't go. And I've never let them get away with that. And to this day, however many years on, I still remember it. So I'd like to go back to that year and go on what seemed to be an amazing adventure.
Well, that's heartbreaking, I would say. But
I was left home to play with my Lego.
If you went back, though, you wouldn't then be able to lord that over them for the years to come. So you would also lose something. Okay. How about you, George? Have you got anything for this?
Yeah, I think I'm quite tempted to say 2019. I think a year pre-pandemic would be most welcome. The ignorance is bliss sometimes, isn't it? But maybe I'll be more optimistic and say 2022. I think that's going to be a cracking year. We've probably totally aged the podcast, Mike, by the way now. But I think that's going to be a good one, I'm sure. So, how about you, Mark?
It's a difficult one. Two years came to mind, but let me pick one. So the one of them was the year 2000, or the start of the year 2000. So before I got into mainstream sort of leadership, I actually used to run some quite big technology areas. And obviously, as we approached the year 2000, all of us were strapped into our seats, wondering whether the whole world was going to come to a close. So I spent the whole of that year sitting in an office, watching all the New Year celebrations around the world, with absolutely very little happening in the workplace. All was very smooth, and so I feel if I went back, I would probably do something else in my life at that time.
I think for me, I think this is a tough one. I think 2019, George, go and buy some stocks in Zoom would be quite a good idea. I was also tempted by 66 for the World Cup, but I think I would go a bit more extreme and go into the future. So maybe kind of 22 or something. I don't know, about 200 years in the future, and see what's happening, see if we've managed to stop the world from burning, and see what new exciting technologies out there.
I'm not sure what episode of the podcast will be out in 200 years time, Ethan, but yeah, it's good to do. Well, fantastic. And Mark and Zeinab, thanks so much for joining. And I think let's get stuck into this week's big question, which is, how is the conversation about disability at work changing? And I think we sort of even gave you a bit of a high level summary of your background, but perhaps could you talk a bit more about your roles and interests in this space, and tell us a bit more about yourself, and give a bit of background for those who don't know you very well. Mark, would you like to give first?
So I actually spent most of my working life in the commercial sector. So in my early years, I used to work for Sir Richard Branson and run Virgin Money, and I've done a number of commercial roles since. Financial services, music, retail, garden centres, care homes, and latterly restaurants before I came to Scope. So very different background. I did spend a year in government trying to accelerate housing in the UK, house building in the UK. And I think that gave me a bit of a glimpse of what might be possible if you to work closely with government to try and drive change. So that was one of the things that interested me in coming to the charity sector. And then I basically, having spent really most of those last 10 years in private equity, decided that I actually wanted to do something which had more of a social value associated with it. So I successfully made a number of investors quite wealthy, but felt that there was something more that I wanted to bring. And so I reached out to the sector and was really fortunate to get an opportunity to come to Scope. I don't have a lot of lived experience disability. My father became disabled in his later life because of his Parkinson's, and one of my really good work colleagues who followed me to 4 different businesses actually had a spinal stroke about 5 years ago, and became paralysed from the neck down. So had some experience of how she's had to adjust quite dramatically in work, really, as part of that. But pleased to say she's still actively working. So, but mainly it was the desire to come and really try and make a difference in the sector. And as you say, there are 14 million disabled people in the UK. So, 1 in 5 of us, that's a pretty big challenge to take on, really, in terms of getting things to work better from the quality point of view.
And Zeinab, could you talk about a bit more about your background and your relationship with disability?
Sure. So I've spent my entire career in consulting. So about 10 years now, with 7.5 at Deloitte. Originally, I was always really focused on working with my clients on digital transformation. So what that meant from the people side of things, looking at change management predominantly. But actually, after having some time out of work and coming back into the business, I realized I just wanted to do something different. And I wanted to sort of be able to relate to my job a bit more than, say, technology implementations, which wasn't something that was really getting me out of bed in the morning, if I'm honest. So that's when I started moving into the space of sort of purpose transformation and really working with my clients to look at how they could drive business growth through better serving their customers, looking at sort of, we hear a lot about ESG and the S in ESG. So what are some of those social sustainability initiatives like financial inclusion, which is an area I lead within the firm, as well as sort of disability inclusion, just thinking more broadly about putting customers at the center of the solutions. And so that's really what I've been doing for the past sort of 2 to 3 years. In terms of my connection with disability and why I'm here today, I do have direct experience of disability. So I was born with a rare brittle bone condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, bit of a mouthful. I was diagnosed at 6 weeks old. And this is something that's naturally played quite a significant role in my life. So throughout childhood, navigating many hospitalizations and fractures and just wanting to play in the playground, but having much time off school, through to entering into sort of adult life and many different challenges, I think, with navigating the world of work, navigating relationships, society as a whole, how I actually felt about the term disabled and having a disability. I didn't really own that term, I would say, earlier on in life, and just really sort of, I guess, understanding what that really means for me in the future. And I think coming back to work after having had time off for health reasons is when I decided it was appropriate and the right thing I wanted to do in terms of being more active within this space.
And Zeinab, you've been at Deloitte for 7 years, and I guess from your own lived experience that you've shared with us, and also from talking about disability with clients, how do you think the conversation around disability has changed, and what was it like when you first joined the workforce?
So with my condition, I think, and many conditions are non-visible, so individuals won't know that somebody actually perhaps is navigating a disability unless they share that with you directly. I do walk with crutches, so ever since I've entered the workplace, it's quite obvious to people that there is something there, but I would say it wasn't often a question I was asked about, and I didn't know in the beginning if it was something I should share. I think I was concerned that if I shared it and perhaps was perceived to be asking for special treatment, and I use that term in inverted commas, would my career, my opportunities be impacted by that? And it wasn't something I was comfortable talking about. But over time, as my condition evolved and I understood really what I needed out of work, I realized it was only myself that I was really impacting by not sharing it and not being more open about what I needed. And so in the run up to me actually having that time off work, I was a lot more open with my peers in the firm and my seniors. And I was pleasantly surprised by the support that I received, and just how much easier it was to sort of understand what adjustments needed to be made in terms of my working pattern and what I needed from work. I'd say that in terms of how the conversation is changing, we still have a very narrow understanding of disability and what that means and what springs to mind when we use that term. I think we are on a journey to understand that it affects people in many different ways, and it may not be visible to you. It may be something that fluctuates, and 1 week you're absolutely fine, and out of the blue something may happen and means you need to take time out of work. And we need to sort of better understand that so we can better support our colleagues and encourage people to be open and have that conversation in the workplace.
Was there anything in particular which made it easier for you to talk about disability in the workplace?
I think it's the connections that you have with people in more sort of senior positions who you trust. And I think that leaders being open about their own stories, whether it is about having experience with disability or not, but just showing that degree of vulnerability, it does make you feel more comfortable in opening up to them. And I would always advise anyone, only speak to the people that you feel comfortable speaking to and only share as much as you want to share. But having sort of people around me that I felt were trusted and I could be quite open about was really important, and that really helps me talk about it.
And Mark, is that a view that you share? You obviously the Scope has a number of priorities in this space clearly, but the sort of communication from senior leadership is that something which enables the conversation to be had in the workplace?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, there's so much about what Zeinab just said that resonates with our experience in the sector. So I think the first thing to say is that half of greater than half disabled people are worried about sharing their condition when they join an organisation. So it's very often that people don't share a condition when, say, applying for a role or going into the workplace, which obviously says something about how accepting that is, how accepting, at least it's perceived to be in the workplace that people can disclose a condition, and also the level of help that someone might want in terms of access to work or reasonable adjustments when they go into an organisation won't necessarily be there at the start if that disclosure hasn't been made. So it's, all round, it's in the interest of organisations to get the most out of the people they bring in, and therefore to make it as easy as possible for those conversations to happen. What you do find, though, I think, is that organisations that hopefully lead in this space and make it clear that those conversations are good conversations to have. And as Zeinab talked about, some trust starts to be built within the organisation, then people do start to disclose. And in fact, one of the reasons why I think the disability employment gap was starting to go down before the pandemic was because more people were getting comfortable about disclosing their condition in employment, rather than necessarily more disabled people were actually getting into employment. So it's partly a good thing. Even at Scope, which is obviously a disability charity, we find that people become more comfortable about disclosure once they've joined rather than when they join. And in fact, when we run our anonymous surveys about how many disabled people we have in the organisation, they're always higher. And at Scope, they run about 20%, which is 1 in 5. But so there's lots to do, because if an organisation like Scope, people are worried about disclosing when they first come on board, then obviously there's a lot of work for us to do collectively as employers to really get to a point where it becomes something that is quite natural to do in an organisation, and and the diversity in organisation is celebrated rather than something that people have to worry about.
And can I just respond to that? Because disclosure is something you touched on, Mark, which I think is so interesting, because we did a survey internally to understand actually what the disclosure sort of levels were and how people felt about disclosing. And the numbers were quite startling, really, in the feedback. And I think one thing I'm learning as I'm in this role within the firm is almost people don't feel incentivized to share that, because there's still so much fear that you talked about. And almost, how can we as organizations really encourage people to feel as though there's some benefit or upside to actually being open about their condition and what they need, rather than it being used against them. And I think that is a significant challenge that I think every organisation is trying to answer. And it's just a really interesting one, I think, especially now as we move out of the pandemic.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? One of my favourites is Luminary Bakery in London. They use baking as a tool to take women on a journey to employability and entrepreneurship, equipping them with transferable skills for the working world. Their letterbox brownies are incredible, and they even have a cookbook. If you fancy a taste, just head to luminarybakery.com or check out the show notes. Now back to our topic of the day.
I think, there are 4.4 million people who are disabled in work in the UK, and disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed as non-disabled people. So there are clearly huge barriers there, already to get disabled people into the workforce. But what are some of the simple measures that could be taken to try and address that? Because 4.4 million people out of 14 odd million disabled people, there's a huge population there who's struggling to get into work.
We talk about the disability employment gap because it's quite a stark measure of some of the issues you just described. So, broadly, 50% of disabled people are employed versus 80% non-disabled people. So there's this 30% gap that exists, and rather soberly, that gap has been pretty stubbornly there for certainly effectively as long as reliable records have been running, certainly the last 10 years. And so there is the biggest focus we have at Scope is on employment, because if more disabled people get into employment, then that gives you greater independence, more financial security. You're in charge of those issues that can lead to inequalities in life, rather than actually relying on someone else to address those for you. So it's a very effective way of addressing some of the issues. And as you say, there is only half of disabled people of working age employed. That means there's over 4 million disabled people who are unemployed. And we know that there are at least 1 million disabled people who really want to work, able to work, fully capable of work, and just are not getting those opportunities. So, particularly with the skills gaps that exist in the country at the moment, it's a big opportunity to for government and disabled people to really be able to address some of the economic challenges that we may face as a country going forward. So we really focus on that, and there are, as you say, unfortunately, quite a few barriers. Probably the first one is that a quarter of employers have never had or seen a disabled person on their list for recruitment. So you start with a big disadvantage there. Now, some of that will be disclosure, but a lot of it is just our recruitment firms really thinking about diversity and really thinking about how they bring a really diverse range of candidates to an employer. We know at Scope that we have to work really hard to get a really good shortlist of people for our roles at Scope. So that is the first fundamental. And then the second one really is about accessibility, and probably increasingly, and something that's become very topical, flexibility over the last year and a half. There are lots of horrible things about the pandemic, but one good thing about the pandemic, it has shown that we can work more flexibly. And I'm really hopeful that will be a step change for getting more disabled people into employment, because once an employer is prepared to work in a more flexible way, then it opens up a range of skills that maybe they wouldn't have had available to them, or wouldn't have seen that they had available to them before. They would have put barriers in their own way. And then the other big thing is, it's all very well getting disabled people into employment, but retaining disabled people in employment is another big challenge. So for every 100 disabled people that come into employment, 120 come out. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, which I could talk about. But those are some of the sort of the big issues and big challenges, but also opportunities, I think, coming out of what's happened over the last year and a half that can be progressed.
So yeah, barriers across the board. Then, from it sounds like from the recruitment stage to actually the day-to-day work, and then also the retention piece. It sounds as I say, opportunities to improve across the board, I guess. And Zeinab, are those barriers which you recognise and can relate to at all?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people feel your first interaction with an organization is how they advertise for a job, what they're showing out there, whether it's on their website, whether it's on sort of the application form, and you start to get a sense of sort of what they're putting out there. For me, that wasn't a factor personally until I actually came for assessment centres at the jobs I applied to, and seeing actually, did they ask questions? Or I remember one occasion going for an interview and coming to an assessment centre phase and having to use a flip chart and not being able to sort of actually turn the flip because I'm a bit shorter. It was just a whole situation. And all of a sudden you feel many, many other things rather than actually applying for the job you're there to do. So I think all of those things are absolutely spot on. And the point Mark raised there about retention, actually keeping people in the job once they're in, is a significant one, because a statistic that I reel off often is that 80% of disabilities are acquired during your working life. So although actually you're not recruiting perhaps individuals with a disability, that maybe many of your employees who at some stage in their life experience disability in one way or another. And it's almost, how are you supporting them? Are you equipped to support them? Do you have the infrastructure? And how are you going to sort of hold on to that talent? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges many organizations sort of need to start addressing. And I think for me, one of the big things is for companies to sort of start going beyond that legal compliance view, of course, very important, but actually starting to look at individuals as individuals. What do they experience day to day? How can you better support them? Actually putting them at the center of the process when they're thinking about solutions, infrastructure, reasonable adjustments, or anything else. And for me, it's a very basic thing where you'll see companies ask for dietary requirements, but do they actually ask about accessibility requirements? And it should just become the norm, these types of things that we do. I think it's really bare minimum things that I'm talking about here that I think need to start to come into play.
Absolutely. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, the stat that you shared, Mark, around 100 people coming in for every 120 coming out was quite shocking, I thought. And I guess it makes a bit more sense with the fact that so many people develop disability in work, but it still feels like a huge number and a net loss, which is quite shocking. I guess that kind of comes to your later point, Zeinab, about there's barriers to coming into work, but then there's obviously barriers within work as well. Do either of you see that in the work that you do, or from personal experience around when it comes to kind of promotion and things? Because I was thinking that from a personal perspective, I can't recall a time where one of my managers has disclosed a disability or has been visibly disabled or spoken about that, or not that they have to, but that kind of senior representation is something that we probably see rarely.
It's a big question. I'm happy to go first, Mark, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on it as well, because I think visible sponsorship and people at senior levels who are open about if they're working a flexible work pattern or what their condition is and how that's been supported throughout work is incredibly important. And I recently went through a successful promotion cycle at the firm with my condition and my situation being very, very well known, and having come back after having 2.5 years out. But that's because I have sort of seen that around me and have managed to sort of really find an environment where I am able to thrive in the work that I do, and I'm able to sort of use the support from the firm to make sure that I'm still doing sort of everything expected of me, my client delivery and all those things, but have the support to do that in the right way, whether that's sort of taking a reduced week or how I travel into the office if it's ever required or whatever those things might be. But I do think sort of senior representation and more active support for individuals who do share that they have perhaps needs around having more flexible working is really important. I don't think organisations provide that sort of active, proactive support of the career development for pathways that aren't sort of traditional, especially within a consulting environment. I think that's a big thing for more and more organisations to really focus on. I think I've been very fortunate because I had a strong network before I went out for sick leave, but that is not the case for everyone.
Yeah, as Zeinab said, it's a big topic, and there are quite a few things I think probably to say. I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked about the National Disability Strategy yet, but maybe we'll get onto that in a moment, because that was quite a defining moment this year. But one of the things that we advocated in that was that mandatory reporting occurred in the workplace around disability employment, and as a minimum, I think there's lots of improvements that can be made. And I think once you start doing that as an organisation, hopefully it starts to surface some of the questions that you should be asking. So what often find in the workplace is that even where someone has put a lot of effort into getting more disabled people into employment, a lot of that employment tends to be at the lower levels of the organisation. And therefore, if you start reporting on things like pay gaps, then that starts to surface some of those issues, really. So I think progression, not only retention, but progression is a big area where more needs to be done. And then also, as was touched on, part of, I think, helping with progression is having more senior leaders who do disclose disabilities and are comfortable to do so. So, half of my executive team at Scope have a disability, but really, we've only really as a team disclosed that in recent months, rather than when the team first came on board. In fact, some of the people that I recruited at exec level didn't disclose disability when they joined, but become more comfortable doing so since they have. And I think once you start to do that at senior level in the organisation, and people see more role models at that level in the organisation, it does start to create at least some possibility around others getting the promotions that they deserve. And the other stat that I always find a bit stark is that over half the jobs that disabled people apply for, they're actually overqualified for those jobs. So you sort of have to you sort of have to work a lot harder as a disabled person to get a role that where you should really, there should be a greater opportunity to progress within an organisation based on the qualifications you have. So hopefully, as there are more role models, hopefully as cultures and organisations start to recognise those role models and celebrate that diversity. And also, I think, as Zeinab touched on, once you start to, as an organisation, adopt a more flexible way of working, and also be flexible about any health conditions that someone might have, then that enables disabled people to flourish more in the workplace and progress more into those roles. And what you would hope in the future is it's not just about relationships that have been established, as Zeinab described, but that would be something that culturally an organisation would want to embrace from the start. And it's certainly something we campaign for at Scope in terms of more flexible sick pay requirements, as well as hopefully a lot more flexible working now happening post-pandemic.
I think we've covered an awful lot just on that answer alone. We sort of skirted around it a little bit, and Zeinab, it'd be great to get your thoughts really on the last 18 months or so that the pandemic has forced a kind of overnight shift in the way certainly office-based work is conducted, and hopefully it is a bit more flexible and how is the impact? What's the impact of hybrid working been on people with disabilities? And I suppose maybe a broader conversation about what about people who aren't office-based? How has anything changed for them at all, and will it ever?
I think it's been an interesting experience because prior to COVID, one of the most commonly rejected asks was that flexibility around your work pattern and being able to work from home. I think was the most denied reasonable adjustment that many disabled individuals would experience. And that goes back to the issue of them not being able to stay in work because there was such limited flexibility being offered to them. And then almost overnight, because it was affecting everybody, these things actually started to come into play. And I think that was almost a moment where it was, I think, a bit challenging for some individuals in the community who have been asking for these things for so long. But significant positive elements of it was hybrid working has meant that there's a lot more opportunities open to individuals. So you're not restricted by whether it's a mobility limitation or the location actually of where you are and where that might be based. You're able to participate in a lot more with fewer concerns about what that means for you day to day, and being able to have the flexibility to manage your time a bit more and actually how you engage in certain opportunities. I do think that there have been certain challenges, which is you're then significantly reliant on technology and the use of technology to be able to accommodate what people need. So, for example, if you are having more online meetings, do you have the capability to have subtitles? Are you providing the relevant technology support for individuals to participate the best way that they need to? And how do you then support your staff in being more open about communicating what their needs are and requirements when you are in this environment where it's very much sort of a neck up engagement? And then when you move to sort of the hybrid world, it's that anxiety that I've heard from a few people of they haven't disclosed that they have a condition because they haven't felt that they've needed to. And when you sort of then go to meet individuals face to face for the first time, there's a split moment where you can see someone's reaction when they perhaps see if you have a visible condition or not, and how you navigate that situation, that scenario, and almost when they're surprised to see someone they didn't expect to see because of, we are just thumbnails on Zoom and Teams these days. And so I think there's been significant positives in terms of enabling people to get into work, and actually how we are a lot more understanding, I think, of people's needs and how we can actually offer a lot more flexibility, still do our jobs and still do it productively, maybe even more so now. I think there are certain things that organizations need to consider around the use of technology, how you encourage people to be a bit more open, show that connection, that support is still being offered if we continue towards a sort of hybrid or online world. I think for those who are not office-based, and perhaps, Mark, you might have more of a view on this, I think, has anything really changed? I think perhaps with a lot more jobs and a lot more things being moved to online, that is just generally a very positive thing, with a lot more services going online as well. But it does go back to that very big question around the digital accessibility of all of this and inclusive design. And that is an area that I think is currently, it's overlooked a little bit. I don't know if many of our listeners know about Purple Tuesday, this movement to almost do a lot more around improving the sort of customer experience for disabled people. I think the statistic of the spending power is £274 billion a year. And it's almost if businesses are not thinking about disabled consumers and how they actually engaging with them, prioritizing them, you're missing out on a significant population there. I heard a statistic that there are more brands for dogs, clothing brands for dogs, than there are for disabled consumers. That was shocking to me. So it's I think there's a lot of talk now, which is great. It's super positive. And I think it's just about how do we take this forward and how do we keep the momentum, bearing in mind some of the challenges that we've seen as well.
Just on your point about flexible working, I know we've spoken about it a lot. I think we did an episode a couple of weeks ago around hybrid working and some of the challenges that poses for organizations. And I think one of the points that was made was around it has a lot of potential to have a good equalizing effect and to bring up communities that would benefit from being able to work from home, whether that's disabled people or if it's new mothers that are burdened with childcare or different sectors of the population. But there needs to be some guardrails in the organization to stop it becoming almost a two-tier system of that. In theory, it's flexible, but those who come in and get the face time and sit with their boss or whatever, they're the ones that are front and center for promotion, or they get the good opportunities. So I just thought it was interesting to raise that point that was raised a couple of weeks ago. And then I guess with COVID more broadly, that was the impact of that was felt quite disproportionately, I believe, for disabled people, both the difficulties accessing the services and also in some cases people needing to shield for coming on 18 months. So I just wondered, as we continue to live with this, how do we, beyond just flexible working, make sure that disabled people aren't left behind?
Yeah, and Zeinab mentioned the accessibility in a number of ways, but if you look at digital or online accessibility, it's something that we focus quite a bit on at Scope because, as you say, there is a presumption that by things being online, that generally they're accessible to a broad group of people. Unfortunately, a lot of online services are not that accessible, and certainly during the pandemic, we looked at streaming services and raised a whole range of accessibility issues around those, which, to be fair, the streaming companies responded to very, very quickly. But we also looked at online food delivery, which obviously was another really key, important thing during the pandemic, and highlighted to the supermarkets a range of accessibility issues there. So there is quite a lot of work to do on online accessibility, because there is increasingly a presumption that that's the main way that consumers will engage with you as an organisation first. And if that fails to work for you as a disabled person, then your next route is to probably go into a call centre where, as you will probably experienced if you've tried any call centres recently, the delays in actually getting to speak to someone are very long. But also, actually, there's quite a lot of accessibility issues in the call centre as well. So if you've come in online, failed there, gone to the call centre, failed there, then you really are struggling as a consumer and a customer to actually get access to the services, which in some cases are quite vital, like online food deliveries. So it is a big and growing area, I think, that needs focus. And moments in time like Purple Tuesday are a good way last week of really trying to bring that to the attention of, and it's in one of the things that Zeinab touched on was the stat of 274 billion spent for disabled people and their families. Because obviously if a disabled person in your family has a poor experience, it's like to influence your overall spend as a family. It's a big actual commercial opportunity for organisations if they get it right as well. So if you don't get it from a heart perspective, you certainly should get it from a head perspective as well.
And I think the frustrating thing is that the technology's there, and Deloitte as a firm, we're fairly early in our disability inclusion journey, but We've recently introduced the option of captioning for online meetings, subtitles, transcripts for internal videos as standard. And I think, for a B2C organization, it's a bit of a missed opportunity not to listen to a huge segment of the market.
You make a really good point, and it was one Zeinab made earlier as well about the presumption of accessibility and inclusion. We as organisations should presume that we should presume that we seek to make things fully inclusive, fully accessible. The tools are there to do so, and because as we had as in the conversation earlier, there are many hidden disabilities and also a reluctance to disclose in certain circumstances as well. Who knows as an organisation how much you're capping the potential and productivity of your organisation without taking that presumption. Presumption of inclusion should go without saying, but even if it didn't, it's in every organisation's interest to really maximise the productivity of its workforce, the engagement of its workforce by that presumption of inclusion. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to try and get across more strongly.
And it just makes good business sense, because I think if you design for this underrepresented group, which it is the largest underrepresented group, but when you look at how it's being prioritized, or should I say not prioritized, it doesn't fail to shock me, even though I know and I experience that day to day. But you are actually designing and solving for a much larger demographic. So even just the use of subtitles, for example, you may be doing that for individuals with perhaps who have deafness, but actually, if you think about somebody who English is not their first language, that's actually also beneficial to them potentially. So it's just actually how we look at these things and see the potential that they can have, I think is significant, and really something that we should sort of start to sort of move more towards, and I hope to see moving forward.
What I'm most interested in, what the negative attitudes and the negative perceptions of acting as barriers to disabled people in the workplace. What are some of the misconceptions and stereotypes that disabled people have to face on a day-to-day basis?
I don't think we have the time for me to go into all of those, George. But I'll try to summarize it as best as I possibly can. So the Workability Network is the network across Deloitte UK to support individuals who have direct experience or caring responsibilities, or for those who want to be allies and sort of better educate themselves. And essentially, we've done a lot of listening to our people, actually, and I think that's been one of the most effective ways to better understand what are some of the challenges or negative experiences they've had, whether in previous organizations or still perhaps experience sort of day to day. And some of the things is just this, which we've already touched on earlier, is the fear of actually being open about what your condition is and how disclosing that with your colleagues, for fear that actually it may impact your opportunities to a career progression. I think another challenge is often around reasonable adjustments and not perhaps knowing what you can ask for and how to get it, and how to do that in more of a seamless way. I think often some of the challenges individuals may experience is almost the policies and the processes around these things can make it a lot more difficult to get the support you need in a timely way, and almost the understanding around some of those things. And it goes back to my earlier point around thinking about the individual in that process as opposed to just very systematically. I think there are a lot of perceptions around, what disability looks like. I've heard a lot about from individuals who have a non-visible condition, that if they've shared something with a colleague, or if they shared something, with somebody else, that they've met something like, oh, but you look fine, or you don't look disabled. And there's often this sort of preconception of what having a disability or it looks like, but also how it affects you day to day, and almost having to prove that this is actually impacting you in some way can also be very emotionally and mentally draining for individuals. And I think there's just a lot more, and we've done a significant amount of this within the firm, which is to listen to our people to understand some of these barriers that they have been experiencing, and how can we better address that through understanding more how to have the conversation. I think there's been a lot of discomfort in engaging in the topic at all, for fear of saying the wrong thing. I think it comes from a good place, or perhaps not having had the exposure to it in the past, so almost feeling as though it's easy to not engage in the topic. And so I think doing a lot more to give people the tools and tips to be able to more proactively engage with their colleagues, to talk about it in a constructive way, and also understand what support we have and that we offer as a firm. And the fact that this network even exists, the fact that other reasonable adjustment supports are available, because some of the biggest challenges are that people can't always see it, so they don't know who has been through the process and who knows what support we can offer them. And I think these are some of the big challenges. And one thing I just wanted to quickly mention is we've actually signed up to the Valuable 500, which is a global commitment, and it's a global movement to put disability on the business agenda, business leadership agenda. And so we've signed up to that as well. And I think it's a hugely positive step in the right direction. Going back to our earlier point about organizations as well taking a bit of accountability to take steps in the right direction. So we've put a commitment in to look at things like the workplace adjustments process, improving things to make sure that our workplace is actually accessible. So looking at technology that we use, looking at our recruitment and retention, and overall just to provide more education to support our colleagues. And I think these are all hugely positive steps. And I like to say it's sort of, we need to look for progress, not perfection.
Time has absolutely flown by on this topic. I'm going to have to wrap this up, and perhaps Zeinab and Mark, thanks so much for coming. But could you, in a nutshell, would you be able to answer, succinctly this week's big question, which is, how is the conversation about disability at work changing?
We're finally having the conversation. I think that is a huge start. So we're having the conversation openly. We are getting uncomfortable with the uncomfortable, and realizing that this is an underrepresented group that we need to do more to proactively support. And I think there's a better understanding of different types of disabilities. And so I think it's all positive, and we just need more active allyship and more prioritization. And I hope that we'll get there.
Yeah, I'd reinforce that. I think the good thing is there are definitely more conversations happening. So that in its own right, the biggest challenge a few years ago, Scope ran a campaign called End the Awkward, and one of the biggest challenges is people just not engaging in conversations because they maybe felt uncomfortable or awkward about what to say and what to do. And I think the more we can end the awkward, the better, and hopefully those conversations will therefore be richer because of that.
Well, Zeinab and Mark, I'm going to have to end it there. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for coming today and talking about this really complex topic. And Ethan and I have learned an awful lot. I can safely say that. But and by the time this episode comes out, I will have done my accessibility training. So I'm really looking forward to that. And this has been a great warm up for that training exercise. And just to say that Scope is a 5 million futures partner of Deloitte, and we work really closely with Scope to provide volunteering, fundraising, and pro bono support.
And finally, just to mention for our listeners, the 3rd of December marks the UN International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and we will be lighting up our Deloitte London headquarters purple in aid of #PurpleLightUp to raise awareness. Thanks both so much for coming in. It was a great conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and hosted by George Parrett, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.